Herausgehört. Der Podcast zur Edition Angewandte. Neuerscheinungen aus der Buchreihe der Universität für Angewandte Kunst Wien. Sanson im Gespräch mit Hani Rashid. Sie hören das Gespräch in englischer Sprache.
Hello and welcome to the third edition Angewandte, which is also the first edition Angewandte in English. And today we will be discussing the Reaction, which is the sequel to the Refutures book, and also most likely the final one that will be published under the name Studio Hani Rashid. And with me here, I have the co-founder of Asymptote Architecture and my previous professor and the person who has been studio head for the last, I believe, 13 years?
12, I think.
12 years? Yeah. Here at Angewandte at Design Studio 3. So maybe you want to introduce yourself briefly for anyone who doesn't know you listening to this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Emma. I'm a practicing architect out of New York City, where we've been, we established the firm Asymptote, a sort of a collaborative between Lynn and myself, where we started really in the art world, producing art installations and sort of theoretical projects, and then kind of branched into architectural practice. But we also veered off into producing virtual reality environments. We produced the first virtual reality New York Stock Exchange, also the Guggenheim Virtual Museum. Then we started building buildings in the early 2000s. Since then we've been all over the map in terms of architecture and design and objects. And at the same time, as you said, over the last 12 years, I've been the head of Studio 3 here, Studio Hani Rashid, where I've had the privilege, actually, and the honor to work with some brilliant young architects, including yourself. Mm-hmm. So one thing that should be noted is that when I started the studio, strategy was that it would become a laboratory for research as opposed to a kind of typical master's degree program, sort of academically structured academic program for architects. And that's been quite successful because the work has moved quite dramatically through a number of different scenarios having to deal with the present, the near and the far future. And as you said, this last book or collection, Action, is really a kind of a culmination of the last 5 years of work, whereas the previous book, Futures, was the first 5 or 6 years of work. And it's an interesting kind of bookend to where the practice was when I started teaching here and where the practice is today, which, interestingly enough, has dramatically changed, like really dramatically changed. And I think it's worth noting that even as I step away from here, the changes are fast and furious in this discipline.
No, absolutely, because I was just kind of like refreshing my mind on the Refutures book. And this was kind of very much a little bit, I guess, in the earlier days. Mm-hmm. And it has a sense of like this like optimism and looking towards the future and imagining all these like futures and the future role of the architect. But then Reaction has a little bit more a sense of urgency to it. And I guess that kind of reflects, especially like the last couple of years now, kind of these different like crises that we've been through, and also like the various things happening on the global scale. So kind of how has this affected the way that you kind of choose the topics to orient the studio towards?
Yeah, no, it's as I said, the changes are rapid. I mean, it's interesting that I think in the history of architecture, in the history of art and culture and so on, and everything maybe, things took a long time, decades, sometimes centuries. And we are in a kind of, at the very tail end, I think, of the Enlightenment, which started 500-600 years ago. But the rapid pace of change is and this is not a plug, but it's asymptotic, and it's moving rapidly. And so to your point, Refutures was coming out of a period of relative naivete, I think, in the profession, where we were still generating sort of form for form's sake. A lot of the explorations of the digital tools was because We were fascinated by what you could do with digital tools, and that fascination was still lingering, even though we were 15 years in, I think, or whatever the number is. And somehow through this period of this decade, actually, and that's why I feel kind of fortunate to have worked here at the Angewandte in this decade, the move has been from a kind of, as you put it quite well, from a kind of, you didn't use the word naive, I'll use the word naive optimism, to a sort of, to a sense of urgency, to a sense of purpose in architecture. I think what's become abundantly clear is that we as architects have kind of, unfortunately, for whatever reason, signed off the problem decades ago. And a lot of other disciplines have backfilled, the voids that we've left as architects in the world of construction, in the world of designing cities, in the world of materials, making spaces. And it's time, I think, for us to reset the jig, I guess, or reset the situation, to figure out what it is about our profession and our discipline that is absolutely critical and crucial to employ in moving forward. And so it is a kind of call to action. It's a little bit like, as I mentioned in another discussion I had on this, that it's also this kind of filmic aspect of when a director yells action, it's time to sort of start to record. So I think it is an interesting kind of it's interesting to see the two books in that light, to also see the kind of and to see the trajectory of the work and the projects chosen over the years that have moved from the final explorations of digital formal work, let's say, and segued all the way to a kind of understanding of the way in which we will need to build, the way in which we need to design our cities, the way in which we need to think about the Anthropocene and think about the future. It's. I think even as I sit here and look at these books in front of me and think about it and look at you and think about your work, I think it's kind of an exciting period to be in. I don't know in the history of our discipline. I mean, the last time there was a period that was this intriguing, this problematic, this kind of confusing was probably when I started teaching at the advent of the digital, when I started the paperless studios with Greg Lynn at Columbia University, and what is it? I hate to say the date, but like 96.
The year I was born.
Yeah, there you go. And we had the excitement and the elation and the euphoria around, and the uncertainty around ridding ourselves of all of, and for you this must sound so strange, and for most people, but we literally ripped off the tables May lines. You don't even know what that is, and all the tools that we were using to draw, but those were tools we were using to draw architecture and to think about architecture for centuries. It's going back to probably to the printing press and to the advent of perspective. So here we were at a kind of a watershed moment where all of a sudden we were replacing standard analog drawing tools, things as benign as circle templates and repeatometric pens, with digital technologies, with a computer mouse. And so that was a brief period of absolute rupture, changed everything. And then it was dormant. Things became sort of comfortable, and architecture started to reflect its digital tools. And in fact, buildings, I used to say, you could almost tell which software was used when you look at a building as you walk down the street, a modern contemporary building. But now, the kind of floodwaters have reached a point, or the dam has reached a point where it's breaking. And I think the thing that's happened on the very day we published this book, I would say, not really, but maybe in that period, was the advent of artificial intelligence in our discipline as a kind of it wasn't the advent of artificial intelligence because it existed for a while and it's been in development, but the idea that we all had access to it, and that all of a sudden people are producing Midjourney and ChatGPT-4 and all kinds of abilities that all of a sudden fall into the hands of almost everyone. again, has, from a point of view of making architecture and thinking architecture, has been the sort of, I would say, the kind of, where the dam is breaking. And so these books, in a strange way, I think historically map through the students' amazing works and the writings by the people who were invited to contribute. They map it reminds me a little bit of I don't know what it would be, but a kind of culmination and an agglomeration of all of the forces that have been at play in our discipline, again, for many centuries, coming to a head and coming to a concentration and a saturation point where it's where we are turning a corner that's never been turned, and that's what's really powerfully exciting. And it's exciting about this generation because what I feel, as I'm leaving the Angewandte now, where I feel comfortable is that I've left behind me with the students, especially the sort of seeds planted with all of you, and maybe through these books lives on a little bit, is a preparedness for this turn in the road, because it is a dramatic turn. And if you're not prepared for it, obsolescence is the other way. And so that's really important.
No, absolutely. I think the kind of end point of a reaction is actually really interesting, especially seeing like this week's graduates. I think this was the first semester where a graduate was using AI, like Midjourney and the publicly available AI tool in the thesis generation.
Well, actually, the entire studio, we did an entire year of AI generated work.
Exactly. Which is very interesting because throughout, I think, the time that I was here, which was just before Midjourney and all these were publicly available, we were still having this conversation about what is the role of the architect when you create these logics, so you create these workflows. Like, where does the formal decisions you make versus the logical decisions of the system you create take over? Where does the architect's kind of aesthetic sense, I guess, come in? And now we've kind of reached another one where you kind of have to add another collaborator to the mix, which is, the artificial intelligence that you're working with.
The interesting thing, and especially, and I know this isn't about, your work in particular, and it's about the entire oeuvre here of work, but even if I look at your work, and I was looking at it last night in preparing for this discussion, the anticipation of people like you and many other students and many of your colleagues, especially your class, had already made, without knowing this was coming down the pipe, is fascinating because it reminds me a little bit of when we first started doing digital work at Asymptote. When Lisa and I first started working digitally, we didn't know what was going on. We were making physical models and drawing and collages, and I did a lot of collage work. And a lot of conceptual work, and all of a sudden, this tool appeared in our repertoire. But we also had a dark room, and in our dark room, which I don't know if you know what that is, we were printing color prints and Cyberchrome and all kinds of. And I came from a photography film background, so for me it was just a natural way to work creatively. And I remember the frustration and the weird confusion we had because all of a sudden we had screens in front of us that were producing lines and noise, visual noise. But we were in the darkroom trying to, produce sort of architectural studies and through photographic means. And it occurred to me, I remember the first project we did, it's called Hyperfine Splitting. It sounds crazy today, but we built a crazy physical model based on a bunch of optical maps and things that we were obsessed with. And these physical models now were sitting there kind of feeling weirdly out of place because we were on the other side, had a brand new IBM computer that was producing stuff. So what we did was, naively, and this is, I think, the birth of most interesting ideas in art. You can look at Fluxus and Dada and letterists and go all the way through the history of art, especially contemporary art, and find this often. We naively said, okay, you know what? Let's mash up these two. The word mash up didn't exist at that time, but let's pull together these two things. And so we built a model. We got photographic paint, emulsive paint, painted our model, took pictures on ectochrome slides off the screen of the computer because we didn't know what else to do. Went in the darkroom, projected the slides of the digital data onto our physical models that had photographic emulsion on them. and produce these crazy, beautiful structures that we were shocked by, and then photograph them again, and then, so it went through this recursive process, and that's called hyperfine splitting, and it's at San Francisco Museum of Art if you ever want to see them in their collection. But it was a completely naive, sort of euphoric, youthful outpouring of potentiality of something we didn't understand. And I would say, to bring it up to what I was saying before, when I look at the works in these books, and especially in your work, and your work very much is on point with this, it's sort of like it's the same dynamic. You sensed, I believe, you all sensed, the students sensed, and through the the kind of programs I set up, there's a sense of change on the horizon. There's a sense of rupture. We don't have the tools yet in our hands, but we will explore. You will, start to explore the potentials for what we think those tools might, in the end, produce. And so it's really interesting because I see stuff coming out of Midjourney that like comes out in 15 milliseconds, and I go, wait a minute, Emma produced that, and it took her a week and a half or 3 weeks. So it's interesting. It's made it very rapid to get to things. And in a way, the reason your generation, I think, is so interesting is that, like my generation, who went from analog to digital, you guys have gone from, I don't know what I would call it, from anticipatory AI into a world where that's beginning to happen. So for some, person who pushes a button in Midjourney, gets a project, gets something super sensual and interesting and visceral and crazy as the work you were producing, I'm not so sure people will know what to do with it. And in your case, because you guys came through, you're in the transition period, you kind of have the equipment and the tools to interrogate what's coming out of a Midjourney or coming out of an AI-generated generative engine. And that's really interesting. And it's not unlike me being equipped with the tools I had to understand what I was being able to produce digitally because I had done analog collaging. The fact that I used scissors and ink and glue at one time made a world of difference when I started working in Photoshop. Like, Photoshop became for me like an unbelievably powerful tool where I could collage and scale. And I know it sounds like crazy today, but the fact that you could do that overnight and today it's the same. Today, with Photoshop AI, it's just an interesting kind of, it's a recursive history with a giant inflection that's happening on that circular action.
No, I think that's kind of really well observed, because I think it kind of reflects on the spirit of the studio, which I read somewhere was described as serious fun. And I think that really kind of well reflects how that through the studio we're kind of taught to really delve deep into the research process, but then also really explore what we're working with. Whether, like for me, it was all the digital tools and all the research that I somehow had to mash up and figure out solutions to problems or figure out new ways to kind of approach these problems. But also now with AI, the studio's been now for the last year experimenting with how do we collaborate with it? How do we work with it? Playing with it.
And how do we
basically.
tame it?
Yeah,
because
exactly.
one of the things that's interesting about AI, and it's not unlike, again, it's a very different world than the advent of the digital, let's say, but at the same time there's some similar dynamics, and the tackling and taming and domesticating the kind of look, I've been working with AI now personally for the last year and a half, maybe, on 2 big projects we did, and I realize that most of my time is spent in wrestling, or I sometimes likened it to multi-level chess. Like having the masters who can play over 6-7 levels of board at the same time in 3-dimensional space. The complexity it takes to think about that is a kind of mindset you need to work with these tools. You have to wrestle them. You have to play chess with them. You cannot take, what is, and because there's an infinite set of possibilities in front of you. So what's your criteria for selecting anything in particular? And that has to come with other things that have nothing to do with the digital, nothing to do with the tool. Has more to do, and you as a musician might understand this better than anyone, has more to do with a kind of an inner a sort of an inner structure, an inner dynamism that has to do with criteria that are very, very complex, ranging from memory to desire to yearning. These kind of words that we use, they are part of the process here. And one of the reasons that I'm these days a little bit up in arms about the profession is that we are slowly, and it's one of my criticisms of the generation that's at work right now, is that if you allow yourself to say, oh, I'm not interested necessarily in architecture, or that means also maybe I'm trying to redefine what architecture is, and that's fine. But to opt out and find yourself not engaged in the profession itself is leaving a kind of a void or a vacuum, and that vacuum is being filled by standard, let's say kind of corporate conglomerate architectural firms, big monsters. And the difference there, and the reason you brought up serious fun, is that to really innovate, you need to be in this kind of simultaneous trajectory of deep research and seriousness, and understand where you can, what we call it, fun, right? Where you enjoy, and where there's joy, where there's mistakes, where you relish mistakes, where you, and so on and so forth. And that's radical procedures for a kind of standard corporate world. And so one of the things you see around you with contemporary building and contemporary architecture is the lack of that. It's becoming, everything becomes kind of pedantic and prescribed. The Venice Biennale this year is kind of an extreme example of that, because you had on the one hand a fascinating biennale about the diaspora and about Africa and about things that we haven't touched enough at all in the history of this discipline, and completely important and extremely critical. But at the same time, you have off-Broadway Venice shows like Kengo Kuma's own monograph show and so on. And the divide is a little bit frightening, because the fact that we've divided the world into either you are building in a kind of a stylized sort of corporate patina, or you're studying things that are really important, but they're off the mainstream enough that there's no access. It's not like radical work and avant-garde work, which eventually is finding always the inroads and access to the mainstream in order to uproot or derail the mainstream.
No, but I believe this is really, really important, especially kind of for me and for my colleagues as well, who kind of now try to venture out in the world and like to figure out what we can do. I think something that kind of gets mentioned a lot in the book, and especially like in this kind of midsection where there is a little bit more of a discussion and people kind of brought in to kind of reflect on the topics, is that as the world is kind of progressing now, or I don't know if we can call it progressing, it's a lot of things
evolving.
are happening. Yeah, evolving, devolving. The architect kind of like, we're generalists, but we're also experts in whatever topic we really burn for somehow. And I think, what the studio does well is that we learn teamwork really, really well. This is a really big focus on that, and I think that's also a skill that we can bring further into the world. And especially now, it's really, really important just to, collaborate with people who can then help make a change, because we need to make a change. Like the book kind of reflects, it's urgent that we do approach various things that has to do with this industry.
It's Brian Eno who talks about this thing called senius as opposed to genius, which I find really fascinating. And Eno's kind of statement on this is that we no longer should covet genius, and we should stop thinking about genius in the way that we've thought about it traditionally, that there's a single, usually male, usually white, sitting on a mountaintop who is the bearer of all greatness and wisdom, and has sort of brought it to us. And his position is very interesting, is that we are actually much more, and he made up the word, I believe. So replacing the G with SC, meaning that the scene and the scene you're in is what should be celebrated. So it's a scenius that you're involved in. These books are very much about a scenius between myself and the students and our teaching assistants and the collaborating writers and symposium. So in other words, it's not so much about the individual hero or the individual trying to make a rupture or a dent or moving the equation forward. It's the scene in which that individual rotates and revolves. It's not the same as a kind of network, in the sense that a network tends to be appropriated more by a business community idea of connections between people across different disciplines. But a Scenius network or a Scenius condition is where, like you're describing, and in fact I think you're doing this in your professional life, where you're working with people outside of the discipline and trying to figure out a way to collaborate to produce new and powerful, forward-looking things. Mm-hmm. Our discipline needs to understand more about that. We've been inculcated, and from like forever it seems, architects have been taught to stand alone against the wind, produce something powerful and dramatic, be radical, but on your own. And before you know it, you're surrounded by other experts. And if you don't know how to collaborate, it's a disaster. We still have leftover traces of that in our discipline, where you'll hear a single name of a single person. I think I mentioned one a few minutes ago. It's one of the reasons why Lisanne and I, when we started collaborating, chose the word asymptote, to be able to blend or work within art, between the disciplines of art and architecture and science simultaneously. And that's always been the spirit. However, generationally, we came out of a time when, I don't know, I can't even tell you the number of times that we would get a phone call from a magazine, or when there were magazines, and they would say, but can't we just use one of your names, and your name in particular, because you're the guy in the couple? And I'm like, and Lisanne and I struggled with this a lot, right, to try and give equal credit and not be, and then talk about also our collaborators. Luckily, unfortunately, it's so great to see, and I don't know how much influence we had on this, but there are so many young practices now that are not single people working alone in some vacuum. They are couples. Their gender doesn't matter. The names are weird. Since we invented the word asymptote, we thought we were crazy, because the only other teams that had names like that were Morphosis and Coop Himmelblau, in which we respected a great deal, still do. And so we had to find another name. But our name was problematic because nobody could pronounce it anywhere in the world, which was kind of the point, I guess. But now we see all kinds of fantastic sort of names of teams and couples and groups and collaborations, and I think that's a really, really positive sign, because to your point, there is no way we're going to solve the future unless we figure out ways of being in the Scenius condition and looking at the Scenius of the situation as opposed to the genius who's in that Scenius, who's supposedly the one who's at the steering wheel.
Exactly. And I think that kind of links back into the various kind of topics chosen for the studio, because you cover very many like different things. Like from like smart systems to you go biomaterials. It's basically all these like small areas of expertise that then the studio every semester then have to dive into and learn about, and then bring back into architecture and figure out possible solutions for it. And I'm just wondering, because now this is like I guess a mashup of 5 years. Has there been times when students have truly just blown your mind in what they've come up with? With sound effects.
Sorry about that. Always. I mean, I know that sounds like a sort of catch-all, but one of the things I will miss terribly about not being here and working with these students and in this school, because this school is very special, I have to say, from a point of view of my own teaching, having taught at Harvard and Princeton and Columbia University and everywhere else, and a lot of other places. The 3-year program here and the concentration, and if you're on your game, the focus you can bring to the studio and the focus the students can bring to the work has produced an environment where I was constantly amazed by things that I was seeing. And that was really great, because I am a perpetual student. When my dad was a painter and an abstract painter and artist, and I remember in his mid-80s I asked him why his paintings were so crazy. And he said, because I'm 32 years old in my head, I don't know what's happening to my body. And I was, I didn't understand that, because I at the time was like in my 20s. Now where I am now, I'm beginning to understand what his feeling was, is that, yes, the mind is capable, if you stay on top of your game and you stay alert, of being a perpetual student, perpetually asking questions, being perpetually amazed. And I think the moment that stops for me is like when you're basically, yeah, then you can say I'm old, because you just don't get it anymore and you're not interested. But if you wake up every morning and you just can't wait to try something, the next thing, and you're astonished by the things you see in the world that really are powerful, that's really the key. And I think in the case of these students and the students here and the work that was being taken on, yeah, I would throw into the mix a kind of a premise. Usually the premises were based on a topic and an aspect that I thought was really pertinent to the way culture's being moved along. And that's why I'm saying that's kind of a floodgate scenario, because each of these things that I was kind of tapping into, whether it was auto drive designed cities, or whether it was biomimetic sort of tectonics, or whether it was bioengineered materials, or whatever it might have been, those were kind of the catalysts or the instigators for the work. And then all of a sudden you see these students grab the bull by the horns, go full throttle into research, producing some very powerful and deep research, which I've always found fascinating, and then turning out projects, and projects that were not in any way expected. So yeah, I was constantly surprised. What I was not surprised by sometimes were, the ones where people would go through the motions and slap on kind of terms and think that they were getting through. But that's okay. I mean, you get that anyway. But I think for the most part, most of the really bright and across the board, the intelligence and the inquisitiveness is key. I learned that in my early days teaching, because I started teaching when I was 26 years old. So, in my first couple of studios, and then at Columbia University at 27, some of my students were almost my age, and so I was like, I said, you know what? Well, then I'm just a collaborator with you guys. Like, I'm called a prof, but I so happen to get my master's degree, and I got this job. So let's collaborate, and that's never left me as a strategy. And I know that sometimes I have to pull the kind of professorial thing because people need mentors, they need authority figures, and so on. But that to me is like it's a put on to get people to be more aggressive about their work and their ideas, and more powerful stuff comes out of that. Yeah.
I think personally one thing that's really surprised me was that I remember when the pandemic hit, which was I think my second semester here, and I kind of expected the work quality to kind of go down and people to struggle to figure out things, and generally communication to be really hard because this all hit us like out of the blue all of a sudden. But I remember, I think it was midterms, the first review we had via Zoom, and I was just generally very surprised. Like the spirits were high, the levels were high, and the project were very optimistic as well. And then, of course, since that, there's been, there are some quite dystopian projects, there are some quite utopian projects. There's always going to be a mix. But I wanted to hear from you. Like, you started teaching at 26, and of course, I'm gathering you've developed many different teaching styles and kind of evolved over time. How did the pandemic, and how did it affect kind of how you were approaching how to collaborate and teach with the students, and has it changed?
Well, what's funny is, and I don't know if this is just maybe part of the sort of anticipatory thing I was talking about earlier, but I started when I was teaching at the ETH Zurich before I came here. I wasn't happy with I don't know if I should say this on tape or on digital, but I found the school was remarkably sleepy and remarkably pedantic and difficult to produce radical work within the confines of what I was dealing with there. So I started using Skype, and I'll never forget, I had an office. We all had faculty had offices, but most offices were full of books and stuff that made the professors look very studious and serious. You got to my office, and glass walls like we have here, and I emptied it out. I put a blue screen up and an infinity screen up. I put a turntable in the middle with 3 cameras, and I said, we're going to look at the work remotely from now on. They literally almost fired me on the spot. I think I lasted a few more months after that. But the reason was that I wanted the students to start to see their work as mediated, as displaced, and from another point of view, and to have collaborative discussions around what I was already anticipating back then, which was kind of holographic potential for seeing work and so on. So fast forward to the pandemic, I'd already been doing Skype calls with you guys, as you know, for the years before. And then all of a sudden, I think the pandemic was like a kind of a massive wake-up call for everything in the world, not just our discipline. Unfortunately, most of what we were awakened to, we've forgotten, like fossil fuel burning and traveling internationally for no reason and so on and so forth. But it also so I was kind of, I guess I'd spent enough time in a kind of cerebral virtual gym that by the time I got to Zooming with you guys, moving from Skype to Zoom, it was sort of a natural occurrence and made a lot of sense. But to your point, what happened was, what I was surprised by was how people did now, and that's maybe why I thought it was time to do a book called Reaction, and why, in fact, I thought it was why I thought things were coming to a head, because what was evident in the students' voices and what I saw on the screen and the work I was seeing was already this dramatic shift to a sense of urgency. Now, not an obvious. People weren't saying, "Oh, you know what? I'm sick of being confined here in my little house in Krakow, dealing with my professor overseas, in New York." But you could see in the work the sort of beginnings of, is this really where the world is going? And is this really what we are going to be putting up with? And how do we get out of this in an intellectual way, in a conceptual way, in an artistic way? And so I think it's maybe literally the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of what I was saying earlier about coming to a head, is that it took the pandemic to, and it's interesting that the pandemic and Zoom, remote, working from home and all of this stuff, not to mention the biological side of the whole thing and the idea of, horrible things that were happening to people in Italy and China, that all of a sudden, it was kind of like, a sort of floodgate open, and then the fact that AI has come on the heels of that, it's almost as if it accelerated this turning in the road. It's like we were traveling along comfortably at like 30 kilometers an hour. I bike, so let me think, 22 kilometers an hour, and then all of a sudden we were like doing a climb maybe, and then we're like heading downhill. Super fast, and not knowing what's going on. And that's really what I feel the pandemic did to the discipline, and has done to the work and done to our profession in particular, but I think it's across the board. It's just kind of interesting. Again, in my conceptual mind, and you know the way I think, there's a crazy, beautiful structure that all of a sudden appeared out of nowhere on the horizon by virtue of all of this culmination of events. Exactly.
And I think that's kind of a nice way to kind of, I guess, turn towards the end, because now your studio's getting taken over, hopefully in good hands. I think we all wish it like the very best, and we're super excited to see where it goes. And you mentioned this also on, I believe it was Tuesday, after finishing up and getting your bike IOA t-shirt. But I'm curious to see what you're hoping that the Institute will kind of keep from your time here. Whether it's, the work spirit, it's the way of working, like all the positive sides that you've seen over the years that kind of make this space a little bit special.
Yeah, it's hard to answer that, because I think that as much as I lament the change and think, I'd love to keep things the same, but I'm also a giant advocate of change, and for positive reasons. So in a way, it's funny, because I even said when I was, called up and said, "Hey, your passport says it's time to retire," and I said, "Really? Oh, I didn't know that. Can I backdate it?" And Gerald said no. But I think what I was basically saying by that was that schools should really run on the fuel and the passion that the students bring to the equation, and the school has as a kind of a senius, and not be sort of hamstrung or tied to rules and regulations. And it's a weird thing. I think it's weird for an art school. Honestly, this is a bit political, I suppose, but I think it's a bit strange for a place that is centered around the generation of innovation, ideas, reactions, polemics, to be working by certain kind of bureaucratic, century-old bureaucratic rules that make no sense anymore. So on the one hand, that's on my mind in terms of how what's happening. On the other hand, I think the notion of refresh, reboot is a really good one and a very healthy one. I think that the only difference in that, the only nuance between those two things is that I think it's the students who should make the decision when they feel that they're in a situation that's too saturated, mundane, and needs change. I changed in my undergrad. I changed my dean. We got together as students and did that. I won't say what happened. But, I think it's important. I think the students maybe don't realize how much they should be in control. And, in the history, again, of ideas and the history of art schools, whether it's the Bauhaus, whether it's the Paris uprisings, whether it's, Beijing, it's the younger generations that have the loudest and most focused voice on what they're looking for. And to sort of be at the mercy of older generations' rules and grumblings is, to me, a totally misaligned reality. But then again, I came here because Wolf Prix was asked to retire. So, I probably wouldn't have done what I was able to do over the last, we wouldn't be having this discussion because maybe Wolf would have stayed on and who knows where things would have gone. So I'm saying this with a kind of it's a double-edged sword. And I think in some respects, if I were to fall on one side or the other, I think the change is a really good thing. And my forced departure is is probably a very good thing in the end. And it's really up to Sam, who's taking over, to take the baton and run with it, and produce, and hopefully, and we had some very good discussions, Sam and I, over the last few days. I brought him to the final reviews. I brought him to my thesis reviews. We sat and talked. I think it's something I wanted to do because I wanted him to understand where these students are coming from, where the program was coming from, so he can segue into his own interests in a less violent way than a kind of, edit, cut, splice thing. And I think, he and I realize that we both have one book that we both love. Our favorite books is the same one, which is a book called Au revoir by Huysman, which was written in the late 19th century. And it was a very weird thing that we discovered that we have the same. And that, I think, was a kind of that's a terrific, if Huysman is the is the kind of hinge point between my work and what he's going to be doing for the next how many years, that's pretty interesting and pretty fascinating. And I'm looking forward to seeing what comes from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very good kind of note to end on, is that, constantly refreshing, constantly learning, being a perpetual student is, that's the spirit of the place, and that should continue.
And it should be the spirit of one's creative process. I think, the biggest thing I tell the graduates here, you included, is that you cannot stop the desire to learn and push the envelope and understand. And if you're told along the way that you should, sit still and just be part of the machinery, you need to get up and walk away. And it's that's the advice I can give. And it's important advice because it allows you to have a life that's really fulfilling in terms of this, as you've chosen, in terms of the discipline that's been chosen and the work you want to do, but on every level, not just producing architecture. But yeah. Yeah.
And I counted the website this morning, and I reached 96 students, including the ones from last week. And then, of course, I think we reach 100 if we count the ones you had this semester. So I think that's a good...
You're actually 99.
99?
Yeah, as of yesterday. I have one more to go.
Oh, amazing.
So I think we've graduated 99 students. Which is a nice number.
It is. It is.
So, and you're all out there, so let's see what goes. Let's see what happens.
No, I think that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. I think we've reached an hour.
We good?
Yeah, I think so. Unless you have anything more you want to say?
No. I can't think of a better moderator, participant, discussion, rapporteur with anyone than you on this, because I think you're you were a phenomenal part of this legacy, I guess, that we're leaving. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you.
And thank you to all the students who are listening and who worked with me, because it's been, again, a fantastic decade plus.
Thank you so much for the conversation today. This was again Hani Rashid, Professor of Design Studio 3, discussing the latest publication, Reaction.
Thank you very much.
Das war Herausgehört, der Bücherpodcast zur Edition Angewandte. Alle Folgen finden Sie auf dieangewandte.at/herausgehört. Eine Übersicht der Bücher in der Edition Angewandte bietet die Website www.dieangewandte.at. Bestellungen unter www.dekräuter.com. Bleiben Sie neugierig.